All right, so welcome everyone. We are here for our episode club. It is April 28th. We are nearing the end of April, and we are going to be talking about the science in Avengers Endgame. It's going to end up mostly be a time travel discussion. I think when I kind of asked people about what science questions they had with this, it was a lot of just explain it to me. Just explain it to me. Some of the fun questions I got as well were things like, can drinking that much beer make Thor look like that? And I think a lot of us are finding out the answer to that question now. And it's been 6 weeks. So I'm going to say scientifically that's a definitive yes. You could say that's a doctor's answer. It's not a medical doctor's answer, but it's a PhD doctor's answer. And then let me see what else kind of questions did we have. We had some really fun ones, so I really appreciate everyone taking the time to talk out. Yeah, trust me, I'm a doctor. I had a colleague once who was really excited that I did, oh, thank you, that I joined the team because then he could say anytime he had a meeting with me as a doctor's appointment. We also got a question on Gamora and the time travel. We are definitely going to get to that. I want to take the time to go through a lot of individual timelines. Like I said, after I watched the movie, I did some art. The art needs to be a little bit cleaned up, so you're going to see the rough version, but I'm pretty proud of it. So we're going to go through timelines, and Gamora is definitely going to be one of those. Because that one, it took me a while, and it actually wasn't until I kind of wrote it all out. It still kind of gives me a headache, so brace yourselves. but yeah. And, oh, I should have got a picture of this, but my partner and I dressed up as Black Widow and Thor from this movie, and he rocked it. He rocked it. He was one of those popular Dragon Con, hey, can I get a picture of Thor? Lebowski Thor, in other words. The Hawkeye timeline, we'll talk about that one as well. I'll post the picture of us as Thor and Black Widow after this onto my Twitters. And I also got a question on the scientific proof that Ant-Man is the best Avenger. And follow-up question, do you think he'd be my best friend? From this person, Justin. So thank you, Justin. I can't speak to the best friend, but I'm pretty sure he would be. Respect for Ant-Man. He just wants a picture taken. That's all Ant-Man really wants. And I think we can definitively say, after going through this movie, that the mouse is the real hero, but the mouse is the one that needed to get Ant-Man back so they could fix everything. So Ant-Man is the best Avenger from a timeline perspective, because he had to be there. You can fight me on that later, but trust me, if he wasn't there, this wouldn't have happened. So those were sort of the first questions. Beer, Ant-Man being our friends. I love you guys. So before we get to the timeline bit, we're going to break into some of that upfront science that they discuss before they actually get into the science of, when they try to explain the science of time travel before they get to the time traveling themselves. Up front, though, because we have to, get pedantic. That's part of what this show is about in a fun, exciting way. Tony Stark is abandoned on the spaceship with Nebula, and they start to run out of air. And it's been about 23 days since Thanos. They mention we see him running out of air, and then Captain Marvel rescues him and brings him back. And because Captain Marvel's amazing, she can do that. And they say it's been 23 days since Thanos. And I would say, without having necessarily crunched the numbers, because I had a lot of other things to worry about, the 23 days would be about right for a good spaceship to run out of air. We don't know how many reserves they had if we just say that, they lost power. But a big spaceship would last a few weeks. So I'm going to say that that's reasonable. Can I explain Captain Marvel? No. Other than she's awesome. And I did like the fact that, the way that they handle her storyline is essentially like, there's only so many of her, and there's a lot of planets, and you guys are special, but you're not that special. And she's got people to save. So other than that, I did like the fact I was trying to think of the physics from Captain Marvel's perspective as she's bringing the spaceship in, because first of all, that spaceship was coming in like this, so it's definitely going to get some heat from re-entry. and it's going to get heavier for her as it goes down. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a problem for Captain Marvel, but it's still interesting to think about and fun to think about. Now, we're going to talk briefly, too, about the ship. I didn't write down the name. I'm terrible at names, and then I don't write them down. So the self-awareness is not 100% there, but it's getting close. But the ship, the spaceship from Guardians of the Galaxy, their FTL method is essentially point-to-point jumps. Now, we talked about this with Battlestar Galactica last week, that what it is it's pointing the Benatar. Thank you. That's right. And I knew it was right because it was somewhere in my brain, but I didn't have it written down. But yes, the Benatar. Now, we're not going to get that deep into it because it's not that big part of a story, but I have had people ask me this before about how the time travel works, and they essentially treat space all as just a big grid. And the Benatar, you might be able to think about it as wormholes, but it seems to be a little bit more point-to-point jumps, because you have all these sort of, you see this hexagon of space-time that they run into and run out of again, and it's instantaneous, effectively. They do have some visuals, I think, in Guardians 2, where it looks a little bit more wormhole-y, but that's because they're just jumping all over the place. And but I would definitely say it's primarily a point-to-point FTL jump that the Benatar, thank you, Enterprise, uses. So they, as we know, I'll do a brief recap. I'm not going to try to recap the whole thing because it's going to take us a really long time to actually get to, but it is going to be important that in this timeline, 5 years later, or no, immediately, see, it's going to be a long one. It's going to be fun. Thanos used the stones to destroy the stones. And then we flash forward to 5 years. That's right. It's in my art. So they find Thanos, they kill him, and then he's mentioned that the stones are destroyed. Okay. Now we flash forward 5 years later. The mouse is the hero. We pull Ant-Man out. I refer to the Avengers by their hero names. Just be aware. Except for the fact, so I've been sick the last couple days, and I have a little bit of medicine in my system, and I wrote down Green Arrow instead of Hawkeye for much longer than I should have. So if you're a patron, you're going to get some limited edition Green Arrow notes from doing this, but it's fine. Now, this mouse goes over the thing, and then Ant-Man comes back, and essentially they realize that time works differently in the quantum realm, that for him it's only been 5 hours. Yeah, him it's only been 5 hours, and for everyone else it's been 5 years. So they realize that the time works differently in this quantum realm because everything is unpredictable, and it's a chaotic environment. It does also have one of my favorite lines ever where he's like, have any of you studied quantum physics? And Black Widow responds with, well, only to make conversation, which hits a little close to home. But that's beside the point. So, 5 hours in quantum realm related to about 5 hours in real life. And he starts to talk about how time is chaotic in the quantum realm, that it might be possible to enter at time B and exit at time A before Thanos' snap, if they can find some way to control this chaos. There is going to be very little science here because it's quantum physics, which is always a great go-to for science fiction to actually try to explain things because we don't understand it very well, and quantum physics behaves weird sometimes. But they bring this idea to Tony Stark, Iron Man. We all know that. Tony Stark and Iron Man, I do interchange, so apologies. But he says, this is the direct line, that quantum fluctuation messes with the Planck scale, which triggers the Deutsch proposition. Now, when I'm watching this, I'm like, quantum fluctuations can mess with the Planck scale. Okay. fluctuations at a quantum level, we don't necessarily understand that well. Basically, the idea is that as you start to get smaller and smaller and smaller, you basically go through different classes of science. You go from, biology and species, organic squishy things. You go down into a species, you break up those species into their atoms. So their atoms are things like carbon, for example. And that's chemistry, right? The interactions between atoms begin to look like and behave, and we study them like we do in chemistry. If you've taken chemistry, you focus on the atoms. If you go down even further than that, then you start to get into the physics realm. And the physics realm, that's where you're talking about, like, how are the atoms stuck together, and what are the energy levels of the electrons, for example. And you start to look at how those subatomic particles, the particles that make up the atom, interplay. So that's really physics. You have physics is subatomic, and then the atomic level is kind of chemistry, and then bigger than that, squishier than that, is biology. So when we talk about quantum physics, we're focusing on that subatomic and even below that level, the things that make up the things that make up atoms. And so that you may have heard of like quarks. And then if you can get even smaller than that, that's where we get theoretical realm of, things like string theory and all completely theoretical, not been observed behavior. But when we talk about subatomic, quantum physics actually starts to exist in stuff that we're kind of familiar with, and that's electrons. Some of you may have studied this, some of you may have not. I won't get into it too much, but, an electron, it's one of the annoying things about physics and a lot of sciences is the more you learn about it, the more it retcons what you learned before that. So when you hear about, like, electrons orbit atoms like planets, and you're like, okay, I get that. And then you get higher in physics and they're like, nah, not really. It's like a cloud of probability. And that's where we start to get into quantum physics, where things are more probabilistic and harder to predict. And a lot of that, it becomes ruled by math. Okay, so quantum fluctuations, basically things that are hard to predict, can mess with I have not gotten to the inverted mobius strip yet. But thank you, and we are definitely going to talk about that. So when we're talking about the quantum fluctuations messing with the Planck scale, that's basically saying that you're getting so low. We talk about Planck limits, and that's kind of where our physics knowledge stops. So when people are throwing things out, like when good old Iron Man is throwing things out like we're going to be messing with the Planck scale, he's basically saying we're going to be messing with the fundamental laws of physics, because beyond a certain limit, this Planck limit, you can say, anything smaller than that, we really don't know. We can't measure it. Physics, for us, stops at that point. And so if you're going down to the quantum scale and you're messing with things that we, as humans, with our technology and our ability to understand, can't comprehend, you're gonna break physics. And then the latter part of his sentence, where he says, triggers the Deutsch proposition, is actually nonsense. And I'm grateful personally that it's nonsense, because I panicked a little bit, because, I try to talk the amount of game that I have, and when technobabble happens and it sounds like something legitimate and I am like, I don't know what that is and I've never heard of that, and then I go to look it up and I find out that it doesn't exist, it's a little bit validating for me. But the Deutsch proposition is not a thing. They did name it. They got the idea from a guy named David Deutsch, who is a quantum physicist who has published some sort of pop culture physics, quantum physics books. But he was very excited. I found an interview where he was very excited to be mentioned in this context, but he said he doesn't have anything called a Deutsch proposition. So we're going to assume that's a Tony Stark brain thing that he's got. So carrying on from that, as I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we can give Deutsch credit for, but you know what I mean. I mean, this is all, we cannot begin to question or comprehend the intricacies of Tony Stark's intelligence, so I will not pretend like I know more than him. And if he says that there's something called the Deutsch proposition, we'll let that go. That'll be my final say on the matter. So, he's basically like, can't happen, you're gonna break everything. And his life is pretty good, so he doesn't necessarily want to break everything. But he can't get this idea out of his head. So he stays up late one night, and as Kishore mentioned, he says, all right, he's like, I have an idea I want to work through. I have a hunch I want to work through. Pull up a mobius strip. Now pull up an inverted mobius strip. It's the same thing. It's absolutely the same thing. I didn't grab a picture of a mobius strip. I should, but you can go grab one. And it's basically that thing that looks like an infinity symbol, but then goes in on itself. And it's like those drawings that if you stare at them, they look like they make sense, but you look like they're a little bit, but the more you look, the more you start to see that like the bits don't touch each other in the way that you thought that they did. And with the mobius strip, yeah, because the inside becomes the outside, and it becomes this, the inside becomes the outside and then becomes the inside. And it is cool, and it's used in mathematics, and it's a valid thing for him to pull up. But so inverting things from a mathematical, I'm going to get really nerdy here. When you invert things from a mathematical standpoint, you're going to multiply everything by -1. If you multiply a Mobius strip surface by -1, you're going to get a Mobius strip, and it's going to be indistinguishable from the other. So mathematically. So I said we weren't going to question Tony Stark, but come on, Tony. Inverted Mobius strip is a Mobius strip. Now, one thing I do like is if you do look carefully and knowing how the movie progresses, you do actually see these timelines like go out and then converge back in on each other. And then he's like, I figured it out. Now, again, they do not get into the details with this. And it's important to note that they do bring in, I mean, agreed. All they had to say was, I have a hunch, pull up a Mobius strip. Oh, and then he says, this is another golden technobabble, give me the eigenvalue of that particle's functioning spectral decomposition. That's a lot of words. And we don't have enough context as a viewer to understand necessarily what he's talking about, because he's like, give me that eigenvalue. Now, if we get into, I know some people are hanging in there just because they want to see this fancy timeline, so I am not going to get into the details of eigenvalues right now, but they are great technobabble, and they could possibly, when he talks about spectral decomposition and eigenvalues, what you're doing is you're taking something complicated and you're breaking it down into its components, in both sense. And so, mathematically and physically. So that's kind of the way we can think about it. And sorry, reading the chat here. The cheese-filled fettuccine and the inverted one is the cheese on the outside. Again, but this is like where you have fettuccine that has simultaneously cheese on the inside and on the outside, and then if you invert it, you've moved the outside cheese to the inside cheese, and now there's no difference between them. But we're just we're just saying. So yeah, the eigenvalue of that particle's functioning spectral decomposition just means take that one and make it simpler for me. That's a good way to do it. There's not so much. Yeah, now I'm hungry. So remember, in this movie, they actually developed 2 different time machines. They have the one in the van. They have basically Ant-Man's machine that they adjust to do time travel. And then Tony Stark comes and says, let me fix all this stuff for you. But when they first do this time travel test, this is another moment that I love, because when I have my sci-fi science brain hat on and I figure out something and then they explain it the exact same way that I figured it out, that makes me pretty happy. But essentially what they're doing, this is where we see Ant-Man being tested on the time machine, and he's going and he keeps coming back at different ages. And what they're doing is they're basically pulling different points from his timeline, not putting him in different points in the timeline. And then Tony Stark shows up and he's like, let me guess, he turned into a baby. And they're like, yeah. He says, oh, that's the EPR paradox where you're pushing time through Lang and not Lang through time. And so, yeah. He's also at this point developed a fully functioning time-space GPS. So good on you, Tony. That just means when he says I've developed a fully functioning time-space GPS, that's like this kind of stuff that we've talked about before, which we love when we talk about time travel, that if you figure out how to travel through time, but you don't have your spatial components figured out, and you're like, I want to just test this by going 1 second into the future, and you hit go, and then you pop out 1 second later, but you forgot that the universe is moving around you, that Earth is rotating, Earth is going around the sun is moving through the Milky Way galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy is moving. That's a lot every second. And so when he says, I have a time-space GPS, we're going to assume that he accounts for all of these, that he knows where they are in time and in space at all times. At all times. So good on you, Tony. Now they start... Now that they think they've figured out the time travel, they start discussing how to behave, right? They're like, we can't mess up the timeline. And this is where it's going to get fun. This is where it's going to get ugly. But it is one of my favorite scenes of any time travel because they started pulling all my favorite time travel movie examples. Essentially, what they're trying to do is they have to avoid what's called the grandfather paradox in time travel, where you don't want to do anything in your past that's going to keep you being able to time travel in the future. That you don't want to kill your own father or your own grandfather, like Back to the Future. Now, and Kishore said we should give Banner more credit. Yeah, I mean, we should, because moving someone through their own timeline is pretty impressive. So we'll give you credit for that one. But, exactly. And I love how much DTG has this movie memorized. Because then he points out that Banner does, let's give him some credit. He really does understand how time travel works. He's like, all those movies are wrong. And by the way, this is at 59 minutes into the movie if you want to go back and watch this scene because I love it. He's like, Hot Tub Time Machine, Back to the Future, all of those. That grandfather paradox is essentially wrong, is what Banner's saying. That he says changing your past doesn't necessarily change your future or your ability to go back in time because traveling to your past becomes your future and your present becomes the past. Essentially what he's saying is you build your own timelines. Anytime you travel through time, a new timeline branches from that, in which you were still able to travel through time. Okay, so you're still able to travel through time. And you haven't influenced your future because that is your whole timeline. And this is actually going to be really important when we look at the timeline of this movie. Because there's one point that does make you think, I think that's a hole. I think that doesn't fit. But when you think about exactly what Banner's describing here as branched timelines, which get really hard to draw by the way, gets real ugly real fast, it does actually hold up. You just have to keep that in mind, that what he's saying is when you travel back in time, you've created a new timeline. That original timeline continues to exist, and you have created a new one. We just don't have time to talk about this. We don't have the time. So, but they still try to patch their holes, basically so Tilda Swinton doesn't yell at them. Now, they have a time heist brainstorming session, which is literally what they called their PowerPoint slides, which I've got to give them credit for because it's fabulous. They essentially say almost everyone here, almost all the Avengers encountered the 6 Infinity Stones at one point in their past. All right, they break up the 6 stones, and now it's time. Thank you for your patience. We're almost half an hour through this, but now it is time to talk about time. So let me pull this up real quick. All right. You may want to make this full screen. If you're watching on your phone, sorry. I will post a copy of this. I'm going to clean it up and then I'm going to post a copy of this, but I am very proud of this. So, I'll zoom in at certain points. But what they're saying is they have all encountered the Infinity Stones at some point. And it's effectively the movies. Thank you. So, I'm really glad that you like it. The Avengers, right, in 2012, and they reference the movies themselves, which is great because we don't have to take it on faith. And it's one of the best, most awesome things about this movie. I really love this movie. I love this movie. And the way that they close the loop is brilliant. All right, so let me give you a quick tour of this before we get into the story. So this over here, if you can see that, is Infinity War. This is where the snap happened. I drew 2 lines here, so I'll zoom in a little bit on it. I drew 2 lines here. This is not to scale. Because at the snap, then half the population disappears. So this is all of the population of people. Now, this is what happens in Infinity War, right? Thanos gets all of the stones and snap happens. And not good things. Now, I think I'm missing a stone there. I'm missing a green stone that was hidden behind there. But the green stone does carry on through the rest of it. So, the Thanos snap happens here. They've progressed. This is where they're hanging out, talking about, we have to go get the stones. The stones have been destroyed. We have to go get them. So we've built our time machine. And now we're going to go back to all of these points where we have encountered the stones, and we're going to go get them. We have a fixed amount of PIM juice. Not PIM juice. PIM particles. And we're going to go get these. But we only have enough for 1 trip there and 1 trip back. Each of the Avengers can go. So, I'm going to try to not get a headache talking about this. We're going to talk about the overall, PIM particles, quantum physics. They allow quantum physics magic to happen. They never get into it. There are time crystals of the Avenger series. We'll leave it at that. There are our Avengers time crystals. And thank you for accepting my pathetic answers to your questions. Okay, so what they do is they go off in different directions, and there was no pretty way to do this. So what I have for the dotted lines, it's kind of what I did. And again, I'm going to retool this on my own time, less of a time crunch. I was trying to convey the point where they're jumping, where they're not necessarily existing in time. The dotted lines means they aren't moving, they aren't physically experiencing real time. The dotted line means they're jumping from one point to another. And if we were to say that every single influence they have here is like a whole new timeline, you can think about this, that even though they jump back here, so for example, Ant-Man gets the Mind Stone, he is like, all right, I got it, I'm jumping. He jumps back, but then there's now a whole new timeline that the rest of the world does live throughout, unless they go back and fix this. So when Banner is talking to Tilda Swinton, forgot her character's name, but Tilda Swinton is pretty good for that. When he's talking to her about where she's like, what are you doing? There's no way I'm giving you the time stone. There's no way. You taking the time stone from me before Doctor Strange gets to have it is going to branch our timeline so screwed up that there's no way to get it. And so you can think about each of these as like, if they hadn't returned the time stone, if they hadn't returned any of the stones, you would have all these different timelines existing. Chaos would reign. That's why we don't want to mess with that too much. So, the Ancient One, thank you. I told you, I'm only at 50% self-awareness. I know I forget names, but I'm not to the point where I write them down so I can remember them when I'm doing this. So, let's go through the Avengers movie timeline real quick. This is where they go back to 2012. So, we're here in 2023, because remember, they allowed 5 years to pass. We're in 2023. We we have Hulk, Iron Man, Captain America, and Ant-Man all go back to 2012 where there are 3 stones in New York at the same time. Bruce Banner, Hulk, goes after the time stone, and after a pretty intense conversation with the Ancient One, thank you, he basically tells them, their gender isn't very clear, but tells them that they are, that Doctor Strange essentially just handed the time stone to Thanos after witnessing what all of the possible timelines would be. And this is what causes the Ancient One to realize that they should just give it to Bruce Banner because they trust Doctor Strange, that this is the timeline that's supposed to happen. So we can imagine that the Ancient One, like Doctor Strange, is able to see all of this, that sees all of these timelines. And when Doctor Strange witnesses them all at the end of Infinity War, this is the one that they chose. So Bruce Banner gets the time stone and goes back. Ant-Man gets the Mind Stone. This is the one in the scepter after hilarious shenanigans with Loki and the rest. He gets the time stone and he goes back like he's supposed to. She could see past her death. Oh, maybe we should actually just do a whole one on Doctor Strange. We should just all watch Doctor Strange and do a whole episode on that, because if we get into the Ancient One and multiverse theory and timelines, it's going to be a lot. But we'll pause that and we'll come back if we have time. So Ant-Man gets the scepter and the Mind Stone and is able to go back okay. Loki, because things went wrong, Loki was Loki and took the Tesseract and disappeared. And I want to pause real quick because the Tesseract is another word for the Space Stone, which I love. I've mentioned this in some of my stuff before, but if you haven't seen, if this is your first time coming to one of these, welcome. But a Tesseract is a thing, mathematically. Now, if we talk about increasing dimensions, you have a line, and then you have a square, and then you have a cube, and then you have a tesseract. A tesseract is a 4-dimensional cube, essentially. It's one higher dimension of a cube, which works out great for our universe because our universe is 4-dimensional, and that 4th dimension is time. That's why we can't visualize a 4-dimensional cube. There's some great visuals where people have done like rotations and stuff, but we don't have, there's 4 dimensions. If you think about 4-dimensional space, that's one thing, and that's something we can't comprehend. But then if you think of that 4th dimension as time, that's also something that we don't necessarily comprehend. And a tesseract doesn't necessarily need to just be 3 dimensions of space and 1 in time. It just means a 4-dimensional cube. But science fiction uses tesseracts quite brilliantly, I believe, in the way that if you do treat time as the 4th dimension and you have control of a tesseract, you would be able to travel through time. In fact, the core of the TARDIS is a tesseract. So, fun facts. Now, carrying on from this, Loki effed off with the tesseract and they went, that's not good. And the Space Stone is what Captain Marvel has as her superpower, right? I think so. Captain Marvel's an interesting one in terms of her origin story. How was she exposed to the Space Stone? Because she's also incredibly powerful, and that power doesn't necessarily come from the Space Stone. I'm trying to remember. Is that just her species as well? But yes, but Captain Marvel's origin story did have to do with the one that you had the Space Stone. Ah, right. Thank you, The Crash. Ah, you guys are the best. This is why I do this live. Oh, thank you. This is why I do this live, because collectively our facts are brilliant. So, when Jude Law shot. Darn Jude Law. And, oh yeah, Brian Greene. Oh, you'll get into the rabbit hole of, string theory really fast. So, okay. So Captain Marvel did come from the Space Stone, but we've established that. But at this point, we have to return the space, we have to get to another point in the timeline where the space stone exists. And like the fact that they remembered that they were able to go back to a point where all three stones were in New York, they also remembered that there was a point where both the Tesseract and Pym particles were simultaneously existing. And so at this point, Ant-Man and Captain America and Iron Man go their separate ways. So Ant-Man takes the Mind Stone and goes back. Cap and Iron Man go back to 1970 to go get the Tesseract out of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s vault. And so they basically take it out. So their timeline's super messed up. This is a whole new timeline where that Tesseract is taken out of the vault. So, ruh-roh. But like the Ancient One said, and Banner explained, they need to just make sure that they bring back all of these so they can collapse the timeline back down, and we'll get to that. Now, Thor, the Soul Stone, thankfully is not too complicated. Thor and Rocket go back to Asgard, and they are able to get the Soul Stone and Thor's hammer, which is important. It comes with them. I track that. So they go and they get the Soul Stone from Asgard, and they are able to bring that back, mostly without incident, but with a very nice scene between Thor and his mother. So in terms of storytelling, fantastic. Now, okay. Now we're going to get to this one. This is where we go to the Guardians timeline. This is 2014. So remember now that they're all traveling and they haven't... If you try to track the individual Avengers... The Reality Stone. Sorry, thank you. The Reality Stone. See, I put a little grid up here, but then when I zoomed in, it disappeared. So I do mean the Reality Stone, the red one. The Ether. The problem is that I screwed it up because I always get the Ether and Soul confused, but yes, you're right. The red one, the Reality Stone. They're able to get it from Asgard, bring it back, no problem. Now, if we're thinking of all these timelines that they're making, they have a ton of branches already because we've had Hulk, Ant-Man, Cap, and Iron Man, and Thor and Rocket all bring back. There are 4 stones now missing from timelines. There are all of these branches that have occurred. But they simultaneously, they're not allowing these timelines to play out. That's a solid joke. Because they're jumping to these points in time, the timelines haven't been able to progress to a point that these branches are actually touching each other, if that makes sense. They all still exist fairly independently from each other because they're grabbing the stones and going back, and they're all doing it at the same time. So if they were to, for example, if Hulk was to go back, get the time stone, bring it back, and then a year later, or let's say, 2 or 3 years later, they would have to go get one of the other stones, the timelines would all be messed up. But because they're doing it simultaneously, they're kind of okay here. They've created a lot of different timelines, but for their purposes and their personal timelines, the Avengers, they're still okay. Now, War Machine, Nebula, Black Widow, and Hawkeye, or as I referred to them most of the day today, Green Arrow. Just, yeah, it's been a day. They all go back to the Guardians timeline, which is in 2014, and it takes place on 2 different planets. One planet is Morag, one planet it is Vormir. War Machine and Nebula stay on Morag to pick up the Power Stone before Quill gets there. So this is at the opening to Guardians of the Galaxy. They get the Power Stone out of the vault. Fairly successfully, save for the fact that entanglement has occurred, which is another great throwaway phrase for science fiction, in the sense that we're like, they're entangled. Because quantum entanglement is weird and confusing, and we don't know the phrases for them that well. So, there exists some quantum entanglement going on, mostly to do with the fact that Nebula has these biotic internals. And so I think they refer to, they do actually, I did write this down, where she's projecting what's going on, and Thanos starts to realize that he's able to see her subsequent past. Oh, entangled consciousness. That was what they called it. But they extract the timestamp from this different nebula, and they realize that there's a different timestamp there, which is kind of cool. You're basically saying that, all right, if we just follow Nebula's path here, right? We have the Nebula that showed up in Guardians of the Galaxy, caused problems, realized the error of her ways, joins forces, decides to go back. All of my describing this is her progressing through time, right? This is her arrow of time. And so when she has gone back in time now, and Nebula, the Nebula that has made this full circle, is talking to them, she has a different timestamp because all of this time is added to her circuits, essentially. But because she's existing simultaneously with the Nebula, this branches a new timeline. And I'm going to come back to this because this is where I thought we might have a hole, and I think it's closed, but the Nebula, Thanos, and Gamora is where it gets complicated. Simultaneously, Hawkeye and Black Widow came and went to Vormir to get the Soul Stone. That's the Soul Stone. And it felt as if they were sharing unsecured Wi-Fi. That's a fair assumption, that their consciousness were entangled. They had unsecured Wi-Fi that they were on. I love that. Just like Thor and Kang. Their Wi-Fi was unlocked. So then we get the Hawkeye and Black Widow story, which I will get angry about. So we're not going to get into too many details of that. But essentially, they've gone back to before Thanos gets the Soul Stone from Red Skull. I hope I got that right. Played by Hugo Weaving. I know the actors, at least played by Hugo Weaving originally. But this is before Gamora was killed. This is before... Yes. This is before Thanos got the Soul Stone, right? We're back in this timeline, so the Soul Stone hasn't gone back. Oh, Donna, you and me both, man. Yeah. Now, regardless, Red Skull is saying someone needs to... You have to... If you want the Soul Stone, you gotta sacrifice something. So Black Widow's the one to go. We won't get into our feelings about that. But Black Widow's the one to go. Hawkeye returns. So Black Widow here is now out of the timeline. If we follow Black Widow's timeline, she's progressed all the way through here. She survived the snap. She was awesome and rallied everyone together and had full Hermione energy through all of the mourning that she was dealing with. And I love her and I am loyal to her. But her timeline progressed all the way through here. She traveled back, and then she dies, right? So, her time has ended there. That's the end of her timeline. Now, remember, too, Nebula, and now here on the chart I call her Nebula Prime. Nebula Prime, who didn't travel back in time, comes forward, disguises herself, uses the technology, and ends up jumping back forward to party with the Avengers and make things difficult. So a different Nebula has gone back. That's what I do. Now, okay, so let's have a look then at what happens once everyone's back, and then well, all right, we have 15 minutes. So let's talk about Thanos then. I'm glad. Thanos our original Nebula and Gamora. And this is where I ran out of paper. So I put their timeline up here. And it kind of works. Because it's all the Avengers are down here. But up above the timeline, what happened was the interaction between Nebula, the Avenger, we'll call her Avenger Nebula. She went back. The fact that she had her consciousness entangled with another Nebula, remember they're both in the same timeline, and we'd been seeing this, that they were existing with subsequent to each other's selves, so there were duplicates of them in these timelines. But the fact that Nebula and Nebula Prime were able to interact with each other changed their timeline. So while, for example, Captain America was able to erase Captain America Prime's brain to not screw up the timeline, that wasn't the case with Thanos, Gamora, and Nebula. So Thanos, Gamora, and Nebula saw what their futures were. Their timeline is corrupted, and a branch has happened. From that branch, Nebula Prime, the bad one, went forward using the Avengers technology. Thanos Prime, now the one whose timeline has changed, Nebula, the Avengers Nebula, and Gamora Prime, whose timeline has changed, and a whole host of creatures, Army Prime, had traveled through a portal. They basically punch their way through to the future. Now, they show up. Nebula Prime rejoins them. They show up kind of subsequently to when Hulk snaps. So I put Hulk snap here because Hulk snapping, remember, they get all the stones back. They don't realize Nebula is evil, right? They don't realize they have Nebula Prime with them, but they get all the stones back. They put it into Iron Man's glove. He snaps. Half the population shows up again. Their timeline theoretically continues, except for the fact that we had Nebula Prime in the timeline, and she's joined, she opened up their time machine and allowed Thanos, the original Avengers Nebula, and Gamora through to the future. From that, and it's important, this is kind of the timeline that I think a lot of people were just openly weeping in the theater, and understandably. But it is important to remember that Hulk is the one that brought everyone back. Doctor Strange is just the one that opened the portals to allow them to all converge on the blown up Avengers facility. Because this is happening on Earth. They didn't go anywhere else. It just looks apocalyptic because Thanos blew it up. And if you watch this a couple times, maybe you remember that. But if you just watched it once, then like I said, it's highly emotional, so you probably weren't paying attention necessarily to the timeline. But Hulk brought everyone back. Nebula Prime caused problems, which caused Thanos to show up, and everyone else showed up. Doctor Strange's portals, he brings everyone back. And it is kind of described when Spider-Man shows up, because he says that he blacked out, he woke up, Doctor Strange was there, and he said, it's been 5 years, they need us. And so they go forward. They go through the portals and join them all and fight, and most of us just can't see at this point because we're crying so much. So, but Thanos Prime is there. They all fight over the glove. Nebula is originally went down to try to get it. Now Nebula Prime ends up getting killed by Gamora Prime and Nebula, the Avengers Nebula. So the Avengers Nebula and Prime Gamora kill Nebula Prime. So she's gone, the bad one. And then Thanos Prime dies by Tony Stark's snap. So Tony Snark, well, that's one for the books. Tony Stark gets the glove. He snaps. And the army disappears. Thanos disappears. Thanos Prime disappears. And Nebula Prime is already dead. they don't say what happened to Gamora. They don't say what happened to Gamora. And this is because if you assume Tony Stark quickly did that, what he was doing there was undoing this timeline, right? He was undoing the fact that there was a corrupted timeline where Thanos, Gamora, and Nebula are aware of, but they're aware of the fact that this has changed. They come forward through the portal. And so it seems that the snap erased that, except for the fact that Gamora is still around. So she does stay. See, I did I did draw her there. It just wasn't clear to me, like, fundamentally why. We do know she escaped the snap. But there had to be some consciousness on Tony Stark's level to basically say, I want all of these people except for her to go away. I want this entire timeline to be erased except for that one. Yeah, it is what it is. And she's out there, and that's fine. So when we talk about the fact that now they undid Gamora's death versus what happened to Black Widow and whether her death can be undone, I think that's where I agree with how they told this story, right? Because if we follow Gamora's path, we have a Gamora through here. We meet her in Guardians. The Gamora we know and love from the Guardians films carries through this timeline, and then she gets killed by Thanos. But the Avengers went through, their timeline continued, they went through, they traveled through time, they tried to close the timelines, but they went back to a point where Gamora was still alive, timeline branched, so there's a new Gamora that's not the one that we know and love, and she is able to survive. So this is 2014. Gamora is the one who's here. This is before she met Quill. As you remember, she needs him. But it didn't really even occur to me, too, that she hadn't even met Quill. She didn't even know any of the Guardians. This is way, way early in her timeline, where she's pulled up to the future. So Gamora's timeline exists, but we have effectively a new Gamora. It's a Gamora Prime. I'm using these terms consciously because this is kind of what they did with the Kelvin timeline with Spock. Now we have two Spocks, and one, we have two. I'm not going to try to compare them because it's comparing apples and oranges, but they're both fruits. and the timeline here is fruit. That we have Gamora able to survive, a different Gamora, a corrupted timeline Gamora, who's existed from the future. So can I start at the beginning? That's probably going to be too much, but I will clean up this thing, and I will slice this stuff so we're able to talk about it. The important thing to take away with each of their timelines here is you have to think of them in the context of the Avengers. So once Gamora Prime has survived, she is now existing in this universe. It really is. She survived Tony Stark's snap, so she was able to continue existing in this timeline. Now we have to go correct everything, because all this mess down here, all of this stuff, this one has sort of been closed. This branch did exist, and people traveled through time, and a new timeline was branched, but it's been closed, right? So it's been closed because everyone died, and there is a new Gamora who's existing through this timeline. This is Spock Prime. Gamora is Spock Prime. Gamora Prime is Spock Prime. She is continuing to exist in this timeline. But other than that, this branch is closed. But all of these other branches are still open. Now, what they do is Captain America he goes back and he takes all of the stones and he goes and drops them off at all of their respective points before the Avengers went to go pick them up, so they're able to continue through their timeline. So it's basically like they've created a loop. Now, this is where I thought that there's a hole here. Basically, the biggest one that's going to make a hole for anyone's and who's caused headaches, and I'm sorry, J Plasmid, that I confused everything. It's fully confusing. And, yeah, I should have made cocktails named Gamora Prime. But I was trying to think, I was like, okay, so they didn't corrupt anyone's knowledge, right? They made sure, like, Captain America Prime's, mind was erased, so he didn't realize that he met himself. Everyone else, like Thor's mom, met future Thor, and she was like, hey, I was raised by witches. I know what's up. I know not to mess with things. It's good to see you, honey. Take care of yourself. But overall, thank you. They closed the timelines by dropping these back, except for this darn one. This one really gave me a headache because I was like, even if they put the stones back, Thanos, at some point, like, he's corrupted. He left the timeline. The timeline branched. But remember, I said we have to come back to what Bruce Banner said at the beginning here, that we're not, by changing the past, we're not changing the future. By going back and accidentally having the nebulas entangled didn't change the fact that Thanos was still able to acquire all 6 stones, snap, cause the timeline to happen. That didn't affect that because this is all our future. Again, if you think about it from the timeline of the Avengers, it works because they have lived through this whole cycle and they have been able to close all of their loops, everything that they did, where they didn't create too many branches to anger the Ancient One. Effectively, what happened, that they were able to put them all back and go peace, 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 and allow at least something resembling one branch to carry through. Now, I can't close this out without Hector's point that he made on Twitter about when Hawkeye tested this by going back to a little bit before the snap and seeing his kids and bringing back a baseball glove. And didn't he create a whole alternate universe by doing that? And the answer is yes. But I would follow up that by saying that sometimes when you make decisions that cause timelines to branch, if we talk about quantum, like multiverse theory, that when you make a decision, it branches a timeline. I've lost a lot of socks in my time, and I didn't necessarily think that future me had stolen one of them. I guess. So in some sense, my timeline was preserved because there was no awareness of the timeline getting screwed up. And that, I think, would be my argument to Bruce, to Clint, to not screwing up the timeline by bringing back a baseball glove. So Captain America, yes, he locked in the future 2023 after the snap by doing all of that. Now, it's important, though, we have to remember Captain America's timeline. He drops all of them off. He goes, peace, 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 peace. Fixed all the timeline. We're all good. And then he's like, you're on your own, people. And he drops back at some point in the past so he can live out his whole life. So I really should have put 2 primes there. But this Captain America lived out his life, and we assume in peace, and we assume that consciously he knew about that, and so he stayed out of everyone's way. At this point, it's funny to remember in 2012, there was at one point 3 Captain Americas on the world, because this past Captain America is there as well. But he knew better than to interfere with things, and was able to live out his timeline all over again. So, a couple questions here. How likely are they to rejoin? So I think that's kind of the thing, right? If the change isn't strong enough to maintain a different timeline, you talk about I'm going to try to keep from getting too mathy on this, but it's essentially that there is some chaos theory involved, right? If you're changing your starting conditions by a tiny bit, you are going to get divergent timelines. But from the Ancient One's perspective, taking the stones was too big that it would like immediately take off in a different direction. If you take something small that's inconsequential, you do have a branch, and this is what I was trying to draw, but it was too hard to kind of get everything in there. You do have branches that kind of run in parallel to the initial one, so they haven't diverged that much. Over a long period of time, they will diverge because of chaos theory, but you can maintain them over the course of a human's lifetime, for example, such that it doesn't diverge majorly from the original timeline. It's entirely possible that glove inspired him to be a ball player. I like that. Schrodinger's cat, in terms of time travel, it didn't and did not occur, and that's exactly it. When you get those timelines that run so closely in parallel over the course of a human lifetime, did it happen? Did it not happen? There's technically two timelines, but they may be indistinguishable to each other. And then, do timelines have energy? Hoo. That's a good one. Yeah, they do, and that's why time travel breaks all of the things, because if you think about it as branching, that energy has to come from somewhere. And so all of these different timelines here absolutely require matter, energy, and physics tells us that all needs to be conserved. So where did that come from? So sorry, physics. All right, I think I've given you all a sufficient headache. I'm sorry. This is the best I could do, and I appreciate that so many of you had questions about this. I am proud of this graphic, and I think it closes. Still, the only one that gave me a headache is this timeline with Thanos, because you've had him leave the timeline, and they weren't able to close it until after the Iron Man snap. And so, but then you just have to remember what Bruce Banner said, because he knows better than all of us that changing your past doesn't necessarily change your future because you have a new timeline. Hi, everybody. We're going to go on a ride. I did record this, so I am going to put it up on my YouTube channel for you to rewatch should you like. The patrons are all going to get access to this. I will send high-res copies when I clean everything up to everyone else. I'm pretty proud of this. It's gonna do it. I'm glad you enjoyed it. This was really fun. This was my entire day was consumed by trying to wrap my head around the timeline and then vomit it at you for an hour. You know what? We'll go with that. All Iron Man did when he snapped was make everything okay. I like that. I'm good with that. So on that note, I love you 3000. Thank you for hanging out with me. Like I said, I'll post this on my YouTube channel tonight. If you need to go back, if you missed part of it, if you want to review some of it, patrons will all get copies. I'll try to figure out, because I do like it. I want to share it with everyone, so I want to make sure that this can go places. But thank you all again for hanging out with me. For patrons, I put up the poll for next week. That's going to close on Friday. So for the rest of you and for everyone, come back. I am going to be back here on Friday for Astronomy Club, and then Sunday for our Star Trek brunch, and then I'm going to keep playing video games, so drop in if you see me doing that. And yeah, I will announce what is our discussion for next week this weekend. So keep an eye out for that. Stay safe, stay healthy. I love you 3000. Get up, stretch, have a glass of water. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks again. Bye.